Have you ever heard something so unexpected, so quietly powerful, that it stayed with you for years, changing the way you look at your own life? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. What my cousin's grandson told me one afternoon still lives inside me, even now. But before I begin, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It happened on one of those late summer days that feel more like a sigh than a season, when the air is warm but soft, and everything around you hums with the last notes of August. I'd driven down to Maple Hollow, a small town in Virginia where my cousin Ruth lived. She'd invited me for a long weekend, said it had been too long since I'd come by. She wasn't wrong. Life has a way of swallowing time whole. You think you'll visit next month, and suddenly it's been 7 years. When I arrived, Ruth's house looked the same as it had decades ago, the old oak tree in front still bowing its branches over the porch like it was protecting the place. She greeted me in her usual way, half a hug, half a scolding for not coming sooner. Inside, everything smelled like cinnamon and old photographs, and it felt good to be there. It felt familiar. Our grandson, Ellie, was visiting too. I hadn't seen him since he was a teenager, lanky and quiet. Now he was in his early 30s, tall and calm, with those kind of eyes that see more than they let on. We exchanged polite small talk at first, the kind you make when you're trying to catch up on a decade in 5 minutes. But later, when the house grew quieter, we found ourselves sitting outside on the porch, just the two of us. The sun was dipping low, spilling orange light over the fields. The air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and the faint buzz of cicadas. I remember thinking how still everything was, how easy it felt to just sit there and not fill the silence. He told me he'd moved back after some years working out west. Said the world had gotten too loud for him. I understood that more than I expected to. At some point, the conversation shifted, slowly, naturally, toward the kind of talk that lingers. He told me about his grandmother, my cousin Ruth, how he admired her quiet strength. How, even as she aged, she carried herself like time was a friend, not an enemy. I laughed softly, saying Ruth had always been that way, steady, stubborn, unshaken. Then he asked about me. No one had really asked me about me in a long time, not like that. Not in a way that made me feel seen. I told him about my life, the job I'd retired from, the house that felt too big some nights, the days that slipped by without much to remember them by. I didn't mean to say so much, but something in his calm presence made it easy. He listened, really listened. Every word seemed to matter. When I looked over at him, his expression was thoughtful, kind, and it hit me that there was a quiet understanding between us. Two people from different times in their lives, meeting in the middle somehow. He told me something then, something that would stay with me long after that evening ended. He said, I think people don't realize how much they still have left inside them. Even when they think the best parts are behind, there's something waiting to bloom again. My grandmother says we carry seasons in our hearts. We just forget to notice when it's spring again. It was such a simple thing to say, but it went straight to a place in me I hadn't touched in years. Maybe because I'd been walking around like it was always winter inside, convincing myself that certain dreams were too late, that certain feelings belonged to younger versions of me. But the way he said it, softly, without trying to fix anything, made me realize how wrong I might have been. We sat there for a long time after that, watching the sky turn to indigo. Ruth called us in for supper, and we both smiled, reluctant to break the moment. The rest of the evening was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of old stories being told again. But even as I joined in, part of me was still out on that porch, holding on to the echo of his words. That night, lying in the small guest room, I couldn't sleep. The window was open, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the crickets calling. I kept thinking about what Ellie said, about how we carry seasons inside us. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for something to change, when maybe the change had to start from within. It wasn't a loud realization. It was quiet, like the moment you first noticed the morning light. I didn't know then that the next day would bring another conversation with Ellie, one that would reach even deeper, one that would make me see my own story in a way I never had before. But that's something I'll tell you in the next part of this story. For now, I'll just say this. Sometimes, the most unexpected voices become the ones that help you hear yourself again. And I can still hear his voice, even now. The next morning came slow, wrapped in a kind of golden hush that only small towns seem to hold. I woke to the smell of coffee drifting up the stairs and the faint sound of Ruth humming in the kitchen. For a moment I lay there, letting the warmth of the sun fall across my face, remembering the quiet talk Ellie and I had shared the night before. His words were still there, lingering, turning over in my mind like a smooth stone in my hand. When I finally went downstairs, Ruth was fussing over a skillet of scrambled eggs. She looked up and grinned, saying she thought I'd sleep the day away. I laughed, poured myself some coffee, and we fell into easy conversation about the family, the weather, and her endless garden projects. But I noticed Ellie wasn't around. His absence felt almost too noticeable, as if the space he'd filled the night before had left a shape in the air. Later, after breakfast, I found him out back, repairing one of the wooden fences that bordered the property. He wore a faded blue shirt and an old baseball cap that looked like it had lived through a few too many summers. The sun caught the dust in the air around him, turning it gold. "Morning," I called. He looked up and smiled, that calm, steady smile again. "Morning. You sleep okay?" "I did," I said, stepping closer. "Didn't think I'd be up before noon, honestly." "Well, mornings are quieter out here," he said, leaning against the fence post. "It's easier to hear yourself think." We stood there a while, watching the light fall across the field. There was something soothing about the rhythm of the place, the creak of the wood, the soft call of a mourning dove somewhere out of sight. It made you feel like time had slowed down just enough for you to catch your breath. Ellie asked about my life in the city, what I liked, what I missed. I told him about the noise, how sometimes it filled the silence too easily. I mentioned the friends I'd lost touch with, the routines that had started to feel too predictable. He nodded, not judging, just listening, and then he said something that caught me off guard. "You know, people always talk about finding peace," he said, "but I think peace isn't something you find. It's something you stop running from." I looked at him, unsure how to respond. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," he said softly, "but it's worth the work." There was something in the way he said it, quiet but sure, that made me wonder what he'd been through. His eyes held a kind of depth that didn't come from books or movies. It came from living, from losing, and still choosing to believe in something. I wanted to ask, but something told me not to yet. Instead, I told him about my art. I hadn't painted in years, not seriously. I used to love it, the smell of the paints, the way colors could say what words couldn't. But somewhere along the way, life had crowded it out. He didn't laugh or brush it off like some people did when adults talked about dreams they'd abandoned. He just asked, "What stopped you?" The question was simple, but it landed deep. I didn't have an answer, not really. I said something about time, about responsibilities, about how life just moved on without asking permission. He didn't say anything, just looked at me for a moment and nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant. That afternoon after lunch, I walked down to the edge of the property. There was an old bench there, half hidden by tall grass, facing a stretch of field that met the woods. The air smelled like rain was coming. I sat there for a long time, thinking about how much of my life had been spent waiting, for the right time, the right feeling, the right reason to start again. Maybe there wasn't a right time. Maybe you just began. Ella came by later, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed me one, and we sat in silence, watching clouds gather on the horizon. He told me he used to come to that spot with his grandfather years ago. They'd sit there after chores, talking about nothing and everything. He used to say, Ellie added, "The world keeps spinning whether you notice it or not, so you might as well look up and enjoy the view." We both laughed, and something about that moment felt light, like the air had shifted. I realized that what I felt wasn't just comfort. It was connection. Familiar, unexpected, and deeply human. The rain came not long after, a soft drizzle at first, then heavier, until we were both damp and laughing, running back toward the house. Ruth was standing at the door, shaking her head and scolding us for acting like kids, but her eyes were smiling. That evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, I sat by the window in the guest room, watching the rain trail down the glass. I thought about the conversations of the day, about how sometimes we meet people who remind us of what we've forgotten in ourselves. Ellie's words kept echoing. Peace isn't something you find, it's something you stop running from. I didn't know it then, but the next day would bring a story from him, one he hadn't told anyone else, that would explain the calm in his eyes and why his words carried so much weight. It would change how I understood not just him, but myself, and it would make that visit to Maple Hollow something I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. The morning after everything settled felt different. The air was clearer, cooler, and the sun shone through Ruth's kitchen windows like it had been waiting for its moment. I woke early, long before anyone else, and walked barefoot through the hallway to pour myself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet except for the old clock ticking softly on the wall. For a while I just stood there, staring out at the back fields that had turned the color of honey. I thought about all that had been said the day before. Ellie's story, his honesty, the way it had opened something inside me that I hadn't realized was closed. I hadn't known that simple words shared on an ordinary day could leave such a lasting mark. I'd come to Maple Hollow expecting nothing more than a few slow days with family, and instead I'd found perspective, maybe even a kind of peace. When I stepped outside, Ellie was already there, leaning against the porch railing, a mug in his hand. He turned when he heard me, smiling that quiet, steady smile that had become so familiar over those few days. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. "You're up early." He shrugged. Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts knocking around. I nodded, understanding completely. We sat down side by side on the porch steps, watching the mist lift off the grass. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It felt full, like something had finally settled into its right place. After a while, Ellie spoke. "You know, when I told you about what happened, about losing her, it wasn't just to share it. It was because I think sometimes people carry their stories like locked boxes, but when you open them, they stop weighing you down so much." I looked at him and said, "Maybe we all have our locked boxes." He nodded. "And maybe opening them doesn't change what's inside, but it changes how you carry it." We sat quietly after that. The world around us was alive, the cicadas starting their song, the soft breeze rustling the leaves, Ruth's wind chime tinkling from the porch beam. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly present, not thinking about what had been or what was next, but just here. Before I left that afternoon, Ruth insisted on packing half her kitchen into my car, jars of preserves, cornbread wrapped in a towel, a jar of her famous pickles. Ellie helped me load everything in, and when it was time to say goodbye, he stood by the driver's door, hands in his pockets, that familiar thoughtful look on his face. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm glad too," I told him. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" he asked. "That it's not too late to start again." He smiled. "It never is." I drove away slowly, watching in the rearview mirror as the house grew smaller until it disappeared behind the trees. The road wound through the same quiet fields I'd driven through days before, but somehow they looked different now, brighter, more alive. Maybe it wasn't the landscape that had changed. Maybe it was me. When I got home that evening, I didn't turn on the TV or check my phone. I went straight to the small room at the back of the house that I hadn't opened in years, my old studio. The air was stale, the windows dusty, but the smell of old paint and turpentine hit me the moment I stepped in, and it felt like coming home. I stood there for a long while, looking at the untouched canvas leaning against the wall, brushes still in their jars, waiting patiently. Then, without thinking too much, I opened the window to let in the cool evening air, found a tube of paint that hadn't dried out, and began to move my hand across the canvas. The first stroke was hesitant, but the next one came easier, and then the next. The colors spread slowly, soft golds, quiet blues, a touch of warm earth tones, and as they did, I felt something inside me come alive again. It wasn't about making something perfect. It was about remembering what it felt like to create, to express, to breathe. As the sky outside deepened into twilight, I thought about Ellie's words, about carrying seasons in our hearts. Maybe this was my spring returning, after too many winters I had built for myself. Maybe we all just needed someone, at the right moment, to remind us that there's still more living left to do. I finished painting just as the last light faded. I stood back and looked at what I'd made. It wasn't finished, but it was beginning. And that was enough. Even now, years later, whenever I walk past that painting, I still hear his voice. I still see that golden morning on the porch, and I still feel the truth of what he said. What my cousin's grandson told me still lives inside me, not as a memory that fades, but as a gentle reminder that life doesn't stop offering you moments of renewal, no matter how many years you've already lived. And if you've listened this far, I hope you'll remember this too. Sometimes the smallest encounters can open the biggest doors. Maybe today or tomorrow, you'll notice your own season changing. Don't forget to like the video, share your story or thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can keep sharing these moments together. And before you go, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know which towns and hearts are sitting here with me, remembering that it's never too late to begin again.